New studies. CO2 output must cease altogether, right away, immediately, with no delay. Anyway, the task of cutting greenhouse gas emissions enough to avert a dangerous rise in global temperatures may be much more difficult than previous research has suggested, say scientists who have just published studies indicating that it would require the world to cease carbon emissions altogether within a matter of a few decades, which is probably not going to happen if left alone by itself. But then again, there's 2012, when God comes back. Anyway, their findings, published in separate journals over the past few weeks, suggest that both industrialized and developing nations must wean themselves off fossil fuels ASAP in order to prevent warming that could change precipitation patterns and dry up many sources of water worldwide. Using advanced computer models to factor in deep sea warming and other aspects of the carbon cycle that naturally creates and removes carbon dioxide, CO2. The scientists from countries including the United States, Canada, and Germany are delivering a very simple message. The world must bring carbon emissions down to near zero to keep temperatures from rising faster than ever. The question is, now, what if we don't want the earth to warm anymore? The answer implies a much more radical change to our energy system than people are thinking about. We're talking drastic change in our energy system. Massive change. I don't see people getting it done. Not likely. Anyway, this has to do with 2012. And why God has to come back, or there won't be a world left. Won't even make it to the 21st or 22nd century. Nope, probably not. Anyway, that's why God has to come back. Although many nations have been pledging steps to curb emissions for nearly a decade, the world's output of carbon from human activities totals approximately 10 billion tons a year and is steadily rising. In other words, emissions continue to rise. For now at least, a goal of zero emissions appears well beyond the reach of politicians here and abroad. U.S. leaders are just beginning to grapple with setting any mandatory limit on greenhouse gases. The new findings make it clear we must act now. Now is the key word, now, to address global warming. But it won't be easy, given the makeup of the U.S. Senate. But the science is very compelling. How can these people duck this issue and still live with themselves in the government? How can it be? Or has it become just so much about money? Warming may continue despite CO2 cuts. Until now, scientists and policymakers have generally described the problem in terms of halting the buildup of carbon in the atmosphere. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change framed the question that way 2 decades ago. And many experts talk of limiting CO2 concentrations to 450 parts per million, ppm. But now scientists argue that it makes more sense to focus on a temperature threshold as a better marker of when the planet will experience very severe climate disruptions. We're already looking at climate disruptions. The Earth is already warmed at least 0.76 degrees Celsius, nearly 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. Most scientists warn that a temperature rise of just 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, could have very, very serious consequences worldwide. If global emissions continue on a business as usual path for the rest of the century, or even for half of the century, the Earth will warm by 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. It won't even, should be more than that. If emissions do not drop to zero, temperature rise could be just out of bounds, more than anybody can even imagine. This is tremendous. The scientists say, I was struck by the fact that the warming continues much longer even after emissions have declined. In other words, our actions right now will have consequences for many, many generations. Not just for 100 years, but for thousands and thousands of years into the future. While natural cycles remove roughly half of human emitted carbon dioxide from the atmosphere within 100 years, a very significant portion persists for thousands and thousands of years. Some of this carbon triggers deep sea warming, which keeps raising the global average temperature even after emissions halt completely. In other words, Earth is a very balanced ecosystem. Researchers have predicted for a long time that warming will persist even after the world's carbon emissions start to fall, and that countries will have to dramatically curb their carbon output in order to avert very severe climate change. Last year's report of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said industrialized nations would have to cut emissions 80 to 95% by 2050 or sooner to limit CO2 concentrations to the 450 parts per million goal, and the world as a whole would have to reduce emissions by 50 to 80%. Conservatively. Glimpse into the future. European Union Environment Commissioner Stavros Dimas in Washington last week for meetings with administration officials said he and his colleagues are operating on the assumption that developed nations must cut emissions at least 60 to 80% before mid-century, with an overall global reduction of 50%. If that is not enough, common sense supposedly is that we would not let the planet be destroyed. But it will be destroyed if God doesn't come back. Because I don't see people doing it. I don't see nations doing it. Not in time. It takes time to change things. And the earth, humankind doesn't have that much time. It must begin much more drastically. Anyway, yes, 2012 is coming.